I'm Travis.
And I'm David.
And we're the Game Detectives.
From Aquamentus to Zaganaga, the Legend of Zelda series has had a long history of boss fights, some awesome and some just plain horrible. But what really makes a good boss fight?
Now, we're only going to look at the 3D boss fights today. If we looked at the 2D ones, we'd be here all night. So today, we're going to have an exploration of the 3D Zelda boss fight.
Every dungeon in a Zelda game comes with a specific dungeon item, and a lot of these items are used in the boss fight at the end of that specific dungeon. So, you use the Megaton hammer on Volvagia, the boss of the Fire Temple, and the bow and arrows against Godon, the boss of the Tower of the Gods. While that is the standard for the series, some boss fights use the dungeon items to greatest effect when they add something new to how the item can be used. For example, in the fight against Kalaktos in Skyward Sword, you use the whip to tear off the boss's limbs, enabling you to use its own sword against it in one of my favorite boss fights.
But other boss fights can be great when they forgo the dungeon item entirely. While most bosses in Ocarina of Time require use of the dungeon item, Bongo Bongo is much more easily defeated using the bow and arrow or the long shot. By not solely relying on the dungeon item, the boss becomes a little more complex and challenging. I think more bosses could benefit from using weapons to defeat the boss besides the one arbitrarily assigned to you by the dungeon.
When Ocarina of Time first introduced the world to 3D Zelda, the game developers decided to make the first dungeon inside of a tree. An excellent idea since they could use the newly gained third dimension to add a lot of height puzzles to the dungeon. Goma, the first 3D Zelda boss, utilizes this third dimension well by climbing up to the ceiling of the room.
And while Goma is not a particularly difficult or challenging boss, it highlights one aspect of great bosses: utilization of the physical space. Most 3D boss fights occur in a circular room, sort of like an arena. But if the boss fight occurs in too large of an area, such as Twin Mold in Majora's Mask, the stage can feel very empty of any real danger, since you can easily run away and it takes a long amount of time to fight the enemies.
The best 3D Zelda bosses have small enough stages so the player constantly feels like they're in danger of being attacked, but not so small that there's no room to move around. For example, the Helmarock King fight in Wind Waker has a somewhat large stage, but the boss is large enough and moves around enough that the area feels smaller than it actually is. By refusing to let you rest during the battle, the boss gives a heightened sense of urgency.
But it's not just size that affects a good physical space for a boss fight. Having unique elements in the stage can be interesting and engaging as well. For example, the MORPHA fight from the Water Temple in Ocarina of Time has a square stage with 4 platforms floating in the water and a thin outside floor with spikes on the end. This unique setup makes you feel as if MORPHA could pop out anywhere to attack.
Another fun and interesting arena is the Goat boss fight, which allows you to chase after the boss by rolling as a Goron. You have to ram into Goat enough to knock him down, and then you can go to town on him. While Goat may not be the most difficult boss, it's really fun and unique, because the boss fight is so different from any other.
Like Goat, boss fights can be great in their ability to just be fun. The Stallard boss fight sticks out in my mind because it's really the only place you ever use the spinner, and it uses the spinner to great effect. You attempt to break Stallard's spine by ramming into him with your spinner, but you have to avoid the stall troops in the arena. Then you have to ride rails in order to ram the Stallard's skull. It's a fun boss fight because it offers something different and unique to all other boss fights.
That points out some of the issues of the worst boss fights. It's no surprise that most of the first boss fights in the game, such as Diababa from Twilight Princess, ODOLWA from Majora's Mask, and Goma from Wind Waker, are often the worst in their respective games. As these bosses merely introduce the players to the mechanic of a boss fight, it can be hard to make them truly fun, engaging, and interesting. These bosses are the easiest, simplest, and most repetitive of the boss fights, making them the worst.
Repetition is why a lot of boss fights fail to be exciting. The best boss fights have a sense of progression, where the further you go into the battle, the harder the boss gets. But a lot of bosses just let you do the same thing 3 times and that's it. The worst offender is probably the Armagoma fight, who is so easy to defeat by simply shooting it with an arrow and then hitting it with a statue. Rinse and repeat.
While Legend of Zelda is certainly not the only series to reuse bosses, the frequent use of similar bosses like Gomas and Dodongos across the series really cuts into the surprise and enjoyment in a boss fight. Again, if you know exactly what a boss is going to do before you start fighting it, it's not really all that fun.
Well, actually, the Imprisoned boss fights are probably the worst because you have to continuously do the same thing in each boss fight, and then you have to fight the boss on 3 separate occasions. It's like the Temple of the Ocean King in boss form.
That repetition ends up making a lot of bosses predictable. If these are really the hardest enemies in the game, you should not be able to tell exactly when it will attack. Maybe for the first few bosses this would be acceptable, but definitely not for the last few, and especially not for Ganondorf or other final bosses.
That became a really big problem in the Majora's Mask 3D remake. While the boss fights in that game are nowhere near spectacular, the remake made it a lot easier to defeat them because they added the new orange eye weak spots. By adding the same exact weak spot to every boss in the game, Majora's Mask 3D just makes the boss fights even more repetitive and boring.
And that's probably my biggest complaint about a boss like Girahim. While I do love how you interact with him in battle using the Wii motion controls, he doesn't attack all that much, especially in the beginning of each battle. However, his 3 different battles are utilized much better than the Imprisoned because they naturally build off of one another in terms of difficulty.
The boss fight with Argarok from Twilight Princess takes place in the City in the Sky, so it makes sense that you battle with the dragon on the tallest tower. But the second stage of the boss fight takes place in the air, shifting the action away from the building and making the fight even more action-packed.
Another great boss fight with stages are all the final Ganondorf fights in Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess. But I particularly like the Ocarina of Time's version, just because of how jarring the final reveal of the monster Ganon is. After you finish Ganondorf, a fun boss in his own right because of the deft use of increasing difficulty, you escape the tower, thinking you finished him off for good. When Ganon comes up from the rubbish, Link's final epic fight with him becomes the stuff of legends.
But part of what makes that final boss fight with Ganon so good is the atmosphere behind the boss fight itself. The colors, music, setting, and character design all combine to make a great atmosphere. For example, a boss like Fyrus has a great mood because the setting is dark and Fyrus himself is the only thing giving off light, making the room feel extremely cramped and dangerous. While defeating him is extremely easy, the atmosphere of a fight makes it a little better.
But all the build-up in the atmosphere might make the boss fight be a real letdown. In the Sand Ship, you have to run from the engine room to the deck in order to defeat a monster attacking the ship. You have to dodge and destroy tentacles as you race to escape the rising water, and you eventually find Tantalus, one of the easiest bosses in the game that might also be Boo from Monsters, Inc. The atmosphere builds your expectations, and then the boss fight crushes them in an instant.
So even if you have cool boss designs, even if you have unique settings, even if you include the weirdest item in Zelda history, the Zelda boss fights only work if they play well. If they are fun, difficult, engaging, and memorable in their gameplay, then they will be great bosses. If a Zelda boss fight is too simple, it just won't make the cut.
So that was our exploration of the 3D Zelda boss fight.
What makes a Zelda boss fight stand out to you? Let us know in the comments.